Hi, everybody. So my name is Andrea Livesey, and I'm an associate professor in history from Liverpool John Moores University. So I'll be here today to speak to you about my recently published book, Voices of the Formerly Enslaved in Louisiana, the WPA narratives. But what I'll do is I'll just give everybody 2 to 3 minutes to join the call. I know that some people might join as we go through, which is absolutely fine. And before we start, I want to just say a big thank you for joining me today, and later James Wilson. And thank you to James Wilson for organising this book talk and giving me the opportunity to talk about this book that I've spent a good portion of my life researching. So yeah, thanks so much to James and to everybody at LSU Press for helping me bring this book along over the years and for being so patient whilst I did so. So, as I said, I'll be discussing the voices of the formerly enslaved in Louisiana. But before we start, I'd like to give a warning that obviously the book is about enslavement. It can be a distressing topic. I won't be discussing any material that is too vivid or graphic or too distressing, but obviously the topic itself is difficult. So as we do go along, just take care of yourself, and if you need a break, take one. Okay, so as I said, I'll just speak in general for a couple of minutes to give people a chance to join before I launch into our main book talk. So I'll be speaking to you for about 25 minutes or so, and if during that time you think of any pressing questions, I can't see you, even though you can see me, just put your questions in the chat, and when James comes back on at the end, he can put those questions to me. Okay, so as I said, I'm based at Liverpool John Moores University in the UK, in the northwest of England. It was at the University of Liverpool that I did my PhD. Now, how did somebody who has been based in Liverpool for so long end up putting together a source book on Louisiana? Well, you may or may not be familiar with the history of Liverpool in relation to the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans. Now we know that by the end of the 18th century, Liverpool really was the centre of Europe's role in the transatlantic slave trade. Liverpool's relationship with slavery is really deep. So we find this really deep entanglement with slavery as we go from the 18th through the 19th century. So even after the trade itself is abolished, Liverpool still has a really close relationship with both the British Caribbean. We have lots of absentee enslavers living in Liverpool. There's a strong merchant trade, so people buying and selling goods produced by enslaved people. And by the time we get to the US Civil War, we see Liverpool as the only British city that sides with the Confederacy. In Liverpool, still standing today, is the building that was the de facto Confederate embassy. We know that money was raised for the Confederacy, and James Dunwoody Bullock, who was a Confederate general, he came to Liverpool to procure warships for the Confederacy. One of those was the CSS Alabama, and formed the centre of a claim made by the US government after the Civil War of the British government. So Liverpool really is, or has been, very, very deeply entangled with enslavement, which is why there is such a concerted effort in the city to really think about those links, really confront that history, but also confront the legacies. Okay, so there's quite a few people doing that in the city, and we've got a long way to go, and we're going to be grappling with these legacies for, quite rightly, a long time. Okay, so I think we're almost ready to start, but I'll just say that I am a specialist in women's history, so specifically women's sexual and reproductive health, which will be quite clear as we move towards the end of the presentation. I give you some really prominent examples where we can find this history within these sources. But as a historian of slavery, I'm always looking for ways that we can use this history to inform and make things better in the present. So for the last couple of years, I've been involved in a project called the Black Maternal Health and History Project. Now, what we've been doing is looking at the role that Black women across the diaspora have played in looking after the health of their communities, and specifically the women in their communities during pregnancy and childbirth. And we've got some really great examples in this book of what these formerly enslaved women thought about maternal health care. So we've been working with local women in Liverpool to have a look at examples like this and think about how we can confront contemporary health injustices. Now, James has promised me that he will drop a link into the chat box below, and if you click on that link you'll see details of an event that's going to occur next week. It's with the United Nations Population Fund, where a number of British and US organisations will be discussing the work they've been doing to confront maternal health injustice. And one of my project partners, Michelle Richards here from Liverpool, will be talking about the work that we've been doing in using these historical sources and working creatively with local women to think about how we can improve things in the present. So there we go. Okay, so let's get onto the book. I've worked with many archivists during the course of preparation of this work, and I really want to say a special thank you and in memory of Mary Lynn Vernay of Northwestern State University in Natchitoches. Now, tragically, Mary Lynn is no longer with us, but I can't tell you how supportive she was of this work as it was in preparation. So I spent multiple visits in the archives at their university, in the Cammy G. Henry Research Centre. And there was one January in 2018 when I visited Louisiana to do some of this research, and it was an unusually snowy January. I believe doesn't snow that often in Louisiana or the South. So, but I'd flown across the Atlantic to use the archive. So Mary Lynn was so incredibly supportive, checking in on me whilst I was there in my hotel, and really helped me get back on track when everything reopened after the snowstorm. So really grateful to her. Also archivists at UNO, Xavier, Tulane, New Orleans Public Library, State Archives, and of course LSU Archives too. So as you can see, the book is quite a fair size. I'm really delighted with the design of the book. You'll see it's a quilt that is depicted. So this particular one is Album Quilt by Sarah Ann Wilson. So whilst we don't know too much about the artists themselves, we know that the images depict family and the natural world. And these are themes that come out really strongly in these stories. And of course, the quilting tradition is a way of passing on stories from generation to generation, which is what this book is very much doing. So the work brings together interviews with the formerly enslaved in Louisiana. But in order to understand these interviews and how they came about, we have to go back to the Great Depression. So the reason that these interviews exist is because of a government agency that was set up, the WPA. And that was essentially a welfare program, if you're unfamiliar with it, to put out of work people back into work. Now, we know that all across the United States, there are schools, libraries, roads that were built by people employed by the WPA. But what do you do when you have hundreds of writers and artists out of work? You don't want to put them to work building. So the government set up a project called the Federal Writers Project. So it was essentially a relief program. In order to gain a job on the program, the writers had to be out of work, so they had to be on the relief rolls, and therefore the quality of the writing of the people employed really did vary. So you had many people who had worked as journalists, writers, poets beforehand, but other people had very little writing experience. So what was the aim of the Writers' Project? Well, when it first started out, the writers were initially told to produce a set of state guidebooks. So every state would produce a guidebook that was supposed to show the local flavour, the local character of that particular state. So this is what Louisiana set out to do. They employed Lyle Saxon, who was a famous writer at the time, as the head of the project, and Lyle Saxon managed the Louisiana Writers Project office in the late 1930s, which was on Canal Street. So the reason why we ended up with a collection of interviews with formerly enslaved people as part of this project was because at the time there was this desire to learn more about folklore. So folklore was incredibly popular. People like John Lomax were traveling the United States collecting folklore and so on. And the historian Catherine Stewart has written that there was a desire at this time to record the experiences of authentic Americans. So what did this authenticity mean at the time? Well, if you think about the 1930s, it's a time that seemed decidedly modern. So you've got cars, which were obviously increasingly people increasingly owned. There'd been a huge migration to cities, a move away from rural America. And this happened at the same time that this huge financial crisis took over. So we'd had the boom of the 1920s through to the Great Depression of the 1930s. So huge changes in American life. And it was also a time when segregation was at its height. The South was in was feeling the full effect of Jim Crow, and people were perhaps looking to a time when things were seemed more familiar. And what they did was imagine this time. So white Americans, for example, looked back at the era of the antebellum South, thinking about how things may have been better there. You know, this was the era of the plantation romance, Gone with the Wind, for example, the book, and then the movie. So, you know, we have this desire to look back on the era of enslavement by white Americans as a better time. And this is reflected in many of the interviews in this collection with white interviewers. Every single interview in this volume is a power struggle between an interviewer and an interviewee. Now, some of the interviewers were Black people who were employed on the project, So Louisiana was one of the few states that had a segregated Black unit. So you had the main Louisiana Writers Project unit that was led by Lyle Saxon, and then you had a segregated unit that was based at Dillard University. Now, interestingly, there was one Black man who was employed in the main Louisiana Writers Project office, and I'll say a little bit about him, McKinney, in a moment. But as I say, each one of these interviews is really interesting from a historian's point of view, thinking about the different factors that were at play in the creation of them. We can look back and see if we can try to understand that interview environment, kind of reconstruct I suppose you could call it the black box, something I describe with my students, see if we can find the black box behind each interview to understand how it was conducted. Okay, so let's have a think about why Louisiana, why does this collection exist for Louisiana? So in the 1970s, a historian called George Rowick collected these interviews with formerly enslaved people that had been conducted throughout the southern states. Now, he first collected the interviews that had been sent into Washington, D.C., that were in the Library of Congress. And then later on in the 1970s, he went round the individual states and found that many states had retained interviews within their local archives. And so he published these interviews as a supplement series. Now, he published the interviews from all of the southern states apart from Louisiana. In his introduction, he writes that he'd spoken to local historians and they had told him that they were indeed working on publishing these interviews. So he didn't publish the Louisiana interviews. So if you're familiar with the American Slave volumes by George Rowick, then you'll have noticed that Louisiana is absent from these. But then later on, historian Ronnie Clayton put together a volume called Mother Wit, which included many of the interviews that are in this volume here. Then later on again, a master's student, I believe, Deneen Arlene Pound, filled in some of the gaps in the Mother Wit volume. And those interviews were published as part of a master's thesis. So I've used these volumes, and these two works are really foundational. Both contain wonderful archival research. However, this is a really complicated collection. The Louisiana Writers Project has a complicated administrative history. There are ways that these interviews were filed away in archives at the end of the project, separated. The interviews were mined for different topics that were going into these guidebooks, whether that be discussions of voodoo, discussions of Marie Laveau, discussions of folk medicine, plant medicine, medical herbalism, lots of different topics. And when the interviews were separated, they were put into separate files. And so when they were sent to the archives for storage for decades, they remained in these files. So really, really complicated history. And as I was researching in archives in Louisiana, starting in 2009, I was finding interviews that I couldn't find in either Clayton's work or Pound's work. I was also finding additional parts of the interviews, whether that be, the poems, the ghost stories, discussions of Marie Laveau, folk medicine. And so I realized that there was work to be done in putting these interviews back together. So that's how this book came about. So at its very heart, whilst foundational work has been done by Clayton and Pound, there is additional information, and I've tried my best to piece these interviews back together from their constituent parts as best as I possibly can. Other decisions that were made as we went along with this book, well, you'll notice that the interviews are arranged by interviewer, if you can see. Now, this was an issue that I really did wrestle with. Now, on the interviews are, you'll see, I'll show you a bit more closely. Maybe you can see that, maybe you can't. So they're arranged by the interviewer's name and then a list of all the interviews that that individual interviewer conducted. Now, as I mentioned, it was primarily white interviewers. So on some level, it felt almost wrong to arrange these by the interviewer. It seemed like I was privileging the interviewer in this story. But I also realised that curating these primary sources was going to be a huge responsibility, and I needed to curate them in the most responsible way possible. Now, anybody who has worked with these interviews will have realised that they are strongly shaped by the interviewer. So we almost need to find a new way of working with these interviews, and that is potentially, I argue, by understanding who those interviewers were and the impact that they had on the interview itself. So a way that I've kind of come to terms with this is that by organising the book by the interviewer, we're actually minimising the impact on their impact on the interview. Okay, I'm allowing people who read this book to more deeply understand their impact and therefore get a little bit closer to that first-hand testimony of the person that was being interviewed. As I mentioned, these interviews are really marked by the negotiation of power within that environment. So first of all, what the interviewers wanted, what the interviewees wanted, and we get little moments in these interviews where we can really see this power struggle. And yeah, we find moments of power for both. So in going into this testimony, I'll now introduce you to 2 or 3 of the interviewers and their different writing styles. So first of all, Robert McKinney. Now, Robert McKinney was a young Black journalist who had been out of work and was one of the first people to be employed by the Louisiana Writers Project. So he was employed before the segregated unit existed, the Dillard Writers Project. Now, these interviews happened in the homes of the elderly informants. Now, McKinney spent a good amount of time in their homes, and we know this because there is so much admin material that is that you can find in archives related to the interview environment, related to the project as a whole, even if it's just letters between people. So we can kind of understand a little bit about what was happening. So in the book, there is a picture of McKinney, courtesy of Xavier University. And I'll read you a little bit that I've written about McKinney and his impact on the interview. So I've written here, despite McKinney sharing the racial identity of the elderly people he interviewed, there is still a reticence to tell everything about racialized experiences under slavery and after. Catherine Cornelius gave a mixed account of her enslavement. She described the good conditions that she laboured under, as well as the fair medical care she received, but also noted that her enslavers hid her and her family from the Yankees who had come to free them, and that, quote, if we were bad, they would put us in stocks, but we never had any trouble on our plantation. Elizabeth Ross Height repeatedly brought the conversation with McKinney around to the topic of her pension. Okay, so that's a really interesting thing that we find in these interviews, the fact that many of the elderly people who were being interviewed were living in really difficult conditions at the time, and they were struggling to get any kind of relief from the government in terms of a pension. And because these writers were employed by the government, Louisiana Writers Project got its funding from the government, they thought that maybe they could help. So McKinney, whilst he built up a good relationship, he still held that position of power, somebody who worked for the government. So I think I just disappeared there for a moment, but I'm back. Okay, so the next person I want to introduce you to is somebody by the name of Octave Lilly. Now, Octave Lilly worked for the Segregated Writers Unit, and he wrote a poem about his informants, about the people he interviewed, that is at the beginning of this book, and that is incredibly unusual. Now, another writer is Zoe Posey. Now, Zoe Posey was a white woman. She was in her 60s at the time of the project, and she was the daughter of a Confederate general. Now, Posey's interviews are littered with racial condescension. And there's an interview with Mary Harris that I won't go into too much. But Zoe Posey really does transform the interview to try to get the people she's interviewing to tell her the version of slavery that she wants to hear. So, for example, Harris tells her that she never got a whipping because she was good and she never talked back, but her mother was beaten for her entire life. And then we get Posey's voice. She says, "We admitted that slavery was a most unfortunate thing, but that all masters were not cruel. Old slaves still tell of their love for old Miss and old Moss, and the loyalty and love existing between them could never have been created in such rancorous hearts." So Posey really manipulates the interview environment, and Harris then goes back on it. And she says that it wasn't the American slave owners, but it was the foreign slave owners that were cruel. So again, telling Posey what she wanted to hear. Now, just before we finish up today, I said that I'd say a little bit about the topic of healthcare within these interviews. Now, Black midwives over time have been pivotal in shaping maternal and reproductive health services, particularly within Black American communities. Now, historians such as Charlotte Fett, Darlene Clark Hine, Deborah Gray White have all spoken about the role that Black midwives have played in the United States. But also historians like Deirdre Cooper Owens, Stephen Kenny have spoke about Louisiana as a medical training ground. It was a key ground for medical experimentation. But what we have in this volume is stories from women who provided healthcare within their own communities. So there is first-hand testimony of plant medicine. So, for example, one woman whose name we don't learn tells her interviewer, "I was born near Baton Rouge in a shack facing the bayou. My pa and ma left early in the morning to work in the fields, and I remained with my grandma from sunrise to sunset. So it is that I was very fond of her and learned many useful things, for she knew the value of herbs and how to prepare them for almost every evil." We also have Martha Grayson. So Martha Grayson was born during slavery, but worked as a midwife after emancipation. She discussed her midwifery practice and how she was going to leave midwifery practice because of the regulations that have been put in place by the US government. Now, we know that throughout the 1920s, there were regulations that pushed traditional midwives out of their practice. So she says, my real work is a midwife, but I'm going to quit. Now you've got to get examinations for the government, and you have to put the drops in the baby's eyes. I used the drops and I thought the baby would die. And you've got to wear an apron and cap and shoes. I can't do that. My feet have got to be on the ground. She also talks about how she prepares eggshell tea for the women. But what I thought was really remarkable is the way she describes her care for the women after they've had the baby. She says that I keep mothers in bed for 3 days, then let them sit up, and then in 9 days they can walk outside, but be careful. So she stays with them for at least 9 days after they've given birth to look after them. Now, that's similar to many of the confinement periods that we find throughout the Caribbean and Latin America. So we have that reflected in Louisiana here. So there's so much in this book, and I could probably have spent about 2 hours speaking to you and giving you examples. But there might be some questions. I'll go back to James to see if there are any questions for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. That was very informative. We do have a question from Dorothy. She wants to know, did you investigate enslaved people who were owned by nuns, priests, Sacred Heart of Visitation Order, or business relationships that plantations might have had with religious institutions? I think that might be a little outside the scope, but did you come across anything like that?
Yeah, so obviously there's around 130 interviews in this volume. I can't think of any specific examples off the top of my head, but I know that there is one person who did live with a priest at one point. Yes, that is quite specific. But yeah, if you have a look in the index for the volume, you will be able to find the theme of religion, and you can use the index to investigate the topics in that way.
I think they're getting at that whole notion about the Jesuits and Georgetown University and that sort of. There's a lot of historical research going on now, and I know that there's going to be a number of books in addition to the ones that have already appeared on this topic coming out soon. Carolyn wants to know if you could restate the name of the midwife that you quoted.
Yeah, so it was Martha Grayson.
Excellent, excellent. I think one of the themes of the book, the one thing that really sets it apart from anything that had been published before, is the way that you talk about this relationship between the interviewer and the interviewee, and the background information that you provide on the interviewees to set the context. And I think that's wonderful. Did you, I mean, and I'm a historian to a certain degree, and I often hear, well, the WPA narratives are biased and they're not really great sources. But what did you find? Is that the case, or is there a counter to that in some ways?
Doesn't that make you so frustrated, James, when you hear that? Yeah, so these interviews, they're so incredibly valuable. And as historians of the United States, you know, as somebody who works on slavery in the Caribbean as well, we are so incredibly lucky to have these first-hand testimonies. And you know, you're right, there's so many factors that we have to understand when we're looking at these interviews. But with all historical sources, there are things that we need to take into account. So, you know, we teach as historians, we teach our students to approach every source, whether that be a primary source like these interviews, or a secondary source, history books that, you know, that historians write with that necessary amount of skepticism. And it's just about finding the right methodology for using these sources, being aware of the issues. Now, over time, we become better methodologically equipped to use certain source sets. And, that's what's happening with these interviews. So, we've had collections that just bring all of the interviews together and present them in a book without the context, without, that understanding of who the interviewers are. But we're pushing that now. We're thinking, okay, who were these interviewers and how were they shaping the interviews? So, yeah, we do get that pushback about these sources being biased, but what I say is, show me a source that isn't biased. We just need to find the right way of working with them.
Right, and I think that's a great point. And what people often forget, or what's lost in that critique, is that the bigger bias is probably the age of the slaves that were being interviewed, and that they only represented one little small, because they were all basically children at the time when they were enslaved, because of how late these interviews were done. So that right there is a way in which there's it's problematic somewhat.
But yeah, I think, obviously that in itself, it gives us that unique opportunity to understand the lives of enslaved children, perhaps. But then, if we're looking at the history of slavery, we also have to think about, okay, well, what impact did it have on these people's lives, and what were their experiences after slavery? And I'd say that is just as important to us in understanding the whole life history of these people. Just an aside, if they're I'd be really interested to hear from people who use these in the classroom. I work with first-hand testimony of slavery a lot in my university classroom, and as one of their assignments, my students will all choose one of these interviews, whether they be the Louisiana interviews or, an interview from elsewhere. And then we do some really deep online archival work, finding out who these individuals were. So we'll look at, census records, any other information we can find. We find out, what their family lives were like after slavery, and kind of really fill in the gap of what happened to these people between emancipation and the time that they were interviewed in the 1930s. So lots of really creative ways that we can work with these sources and use them as a kind of a starting point for something much bigger.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, questions are starting to roll in now.
Great.
Lewis Love was interviewed, enslaved by my second great grandfather. He also gave that mixed commentary. My master was the best, whipped us, was the best, and they whipped us, etc. It seems contradictory there. Can you comment on that? Well, I think that what they're kind of getting at is the content of most of the narratives, and was it one-sided? Did it depend? How heavily did it depend on the interviewee? And does it run the full spectrum of what you might expect?
Yeah, it absolutely does. Yes, that's really fascinating that you've got that personal connection there. So what I would say is, I mentioned earlier in the presentation that each one of these interviews is kind of a fight for power over that interview space. And we can look for little clues of what the interviewer is doing in this situation. Now, we'll never know exactly what's happening, but what I say to my students is, if you have contradictory testimony there, then something is probably happening. So, if you can imagine you're in a room with somebody who's quite hostile, and you're telling a story, and you're looking at their facial expression, and their facial expression's changed, you might suddenly change your testimony. Now, sometimes it's easy to read and sometimes it isn't, but it's really getting to grips with that power relationship. We also have to realize that there are multiple points at which this testimony can be shaped. So in the introduction to this, I've come up with a little flow chart to really help to visualize that, to show the moments of potential shaping. So they range from in the interview itself through to when the interviewer was either writing up or typing up their interview notes. Then we've got the state office, so when they pass those notes to the state writer's office. The editor may potentially have changed the interview there. So there are these different moments where the story can change. So as I said, incredibly difficult sources to work with, but if you find contradictory testimony, just pick up on clues within the interview. Have a look to see if the interviewer is inserting themselves in the discussion.
It's interesting that you mentioned sources, because our next question comes from Deborah, and she asks, are you familiar with the 78 RPM album called Bayou Ballads of Louisiana Plantations? I picked it up recently at a secondhand record store, have yet to listen to it, but it may be related to WPA collection efforts.
Wow. So what's the name of that again? Bayou Ballads?
Bayou Ballads of Louisiana Plantations.
I am not familiar with that, but thank you, Deborah. I'll certainly look into that. Yeah, so obviously this was a folklore project. So John Lomax, if you're familiar with him and his folklore work, he was really interested in songs. So he advised the interviewers to ask the people who were being interviewed if they had any interesting songs that they could remember. So we do get the odd song in here, which is great. Sometimes they relate to enslavement, sometimes not at all. Yeah, and another thing to mention as well is there's an interview with Uncle Bob Ledbetter that is available in, he was an enslaved man, it's available in the Library of Congress, but he was the grandfather of Leadbelly, the musician. So you can listen to that one at the Library of Congress if you're interested in that.
Our next question is from Brittany, and she says, museum professional, African-American historian, and college professor here. Will this be available or have an additional workbook for students if I add this to my syllabi?
Oh, wow. There isn't thank you for that, Brittany. There isn't a workbook available with it. I am actually at the moment in the middle of finishing up a companion volume to this, so speaking a little bit more about those power relationships within the interviews. So that is, I can't give you a date when that will come out. Thank you, LSU, for your patience. But yeah, if feel free to get in contact if you want to speak to me about, how it might be used in the classroom. I'd love to, I'm really interested in pedagogy. So, I'd love to have a chat about that.
And all of the comments will be available, Andrea, after the fact, and you can reply to them and share your contact information, etc. Okay, we have a comment here. Given that midwifery now necessitates a nursing degree, do you think this has influenced minority communities? I think the whole tradition that you talk about, from the enslaved element down to the current.
Yeah. So does it affect minority communities? So gosh, this is a really huge question. But yeah, so important. So thank you. So midwifery. Now we know that midwifery practice has changed significantly from the 19th century to the present day. Now Traditional midwives have had an ancestral practice, so they kind of learn on the job. Often, knowledge was passed down and so on, but obviously this changes as we go through into the 20th century. What that also means is knowledge somewhat comes out of communities and into white dominated medical spaces. So whilst obviously certain regulations around midwifery, it had to be done and it had to be a good thing. What you do get is kind of a lack of confidence and knowledge within communities, and this particularly impacts marginalized communities. So yes, I agree. And this is the case both in the United States, but also in the Caribbean, Latin America, and to an extent in Britain too, where this knowledge moves out of communities and into medical spaces where that same trust doesn't necessarily exist. I hope that answers the question.
Interesting. And this person also mentioned that there's in rural Tennessee, they still have one of the few remaining competency-based midwifery, I think, programs or training programs costing around $20,000, they say. Brittany also asked about future exhibits or online or virtual projects. And I think a good number of these are available digitally already, correct?
The interviews.
Yes.
Yes, yeah. So some of them you can find online, Louisiana Digital Library. You can find some of that. In terms of exhibits, nothing planned at the moment. I have been having some conversations. There will be something hopefully in Liverpool. We have the International Slavery Museum, which is Britain's national slavery museum here in Liverpool. So if anybody is UK based, then hopefully some of this material will be available there. We do have an exhibition on in Liverpool in the UK at the moment around midwifery, but I know that's quite far to travel for maybe a lot of people who are with us today. So yeah, that was a very long way of saying watch this space. Hopefully we can arrange something.
And that reminds me, and I think this is a point that you should talk about here. I think you have a little knowledge of this. Southern University, John B. Cade also had a project, an African American professor at Southern, and I think he was somewhere in Texas before that, but he did a slave interview project outside of the WPA. And I know some of those are available through Southern's online archive, I think. But can you talk about the John B. Cade, the difference between what you're dealing with here and the project that he did?
Yeah, no, so that's really interesting. So the Cade interviews, I haven't looked at these for a long time, actually, so I'm a little bit rusty on my knowledge. But the difference between the Cade interviews and these interviews, so these interviews were obviously conducted as part of the Federal Writers Project, the WPA. Majority white interviewers, but some Black interviewers, and those interviews are particularly valuable. But the Cade interviews, so John B. Cade conducted those interviews with his students. So it was kind of a university student project at the two different universities that you mentioned, James. And they were all Black interviewers. So whilst as I say in the book, you can't use the race of the interviewer as a shortcut for whether, for the most reliable interviews in inverted commas. You do find that the information is often richer and more detailed, and the interviews last for a little bit longer because in the context of Jim Crow, obviously the people felt more comfortable. So yeah, they are, last time I looked, available online. So yeah, do have a look at those, and compare them to these government sponsored interviews. You have a look at the differences.
Yeah, I think that's a project waiting for someone else to do, and it's often overlooked that they have that whole set there. Well, that's been wonderful, and the question we like to close with for our authors is, well, what are you working on next? And you've kind of gave us a preview, but you want to talk more about that?
I can say a little bit, yeah. So so I am almost done actually with a companion volume to this. So as I mentioned in the talk, there is just a wealth of, if you're interested in administrative history, it's far more interesting than it sounds. There's so much available in Louisiana Archive. So I've actually managed to put an entire book together on the construction of race through both the interviews with the formerly enslaved, but also a good number of interviews that were conducted with younger people in Louisiana. Italians living in Louisiana. So there's all kinds of interesting things that's going on with this project. So yeah, there's a book coming out which is I suppose you could say a companion volume to this one. And also I'm continuing working on my kind of long-term work, which is half history, half advocacy, really thinking about how we can use historical testimony in a creative way to improve maternal health outcomes for everyone.
We have one last question that someone posted, Andrea, about the John Cade interviews. Do you recall what years those were conducted? I know it was a long period of time, I think.
It was a little bit earlier, I believe. I think it
That's what
was
I
around,
thought. I wanted to say the late
yeah,
20s.
yeah, I think it was around 1929, 30 that they were conducted. Yeah.
That was my recollection as well. Well, that's all we have for today. And if you want to go ahead and thank everyone and sign off.
Yeah, so thank you everybody, thank you everybody at LSU who've been so amazing and supportive through the process of putting this book together. Thank you, James, for organising today and moderating the discussion. And thank you everybody who's asked a question. You give me lots to think about. Thanks everyone. Bye.